on, my friends? This is Rick, and this is your seat at the table, and we are looking at House Arano, the Augurian Coalition. And I apologize if I'm butchering the pronunciation of these things because it's a bit of a tongue twister for me. This was on a recommendation from one of my viewers. Said that they would like to see my opinions on this thing, and it's based on one of the earlier video games, I understand. Which like I said, I've never had the opportunity to play any of the real graphic heavy video games for BattleTech. I simply don't have the money to own the computer systems that are required to run those things, and I've never been a big fan of the console games. There's nothing wrong with them. I've played them with other friends who owned them, but myself, I've never had a Nintendo or an Xbox or an Atari. Or it shows you how old I am because I'm talking stuff that's from 30 years ago. So it's a money thing. My choice was to spend money on the hardcover stuff for tabletop things. So I've read through this twice, and it's very interesting. It's actually pretty nice, and we'll do a glance over on it, and then I'll get into some stuff I have some thoughts on. The perception from this source book is from the idea of an intelligence briefing for the magistrate of Canopus from her intelligence service on the events and the operations and things that took place during a brief ending period of this particular house. And my understanding is that the house was originally established and from a collection of independent planets. And let's see, the regional Augurian reach lies between our spinward border with the anti-spinward border of the Turian Concordat. This area is lightly inhabited outside the Augurian Coalition systems and is not claimed by any of the major powers. And this is Frankie, our shelter cat, who just decides she wants to get in and check on things. You're gonna check on stuff? Is that gonna check on it? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's Daddy's classes. Okay, so you get on the floor. Yes, I know. Can't have you up here because you might want to climb on the laptop, and that would be a bad day. So, area lightly inhabited, always the case. However, one time this corner space was the frontier of an ever-expanding, compelling confederation, and the site of our own abortive power struggles with the Turian Concordat. Basically, this whole region of space that they're talking about is kind of like a triangle of no man land kind of layout. It's an area that's been contested over the centuries between the two periphery nations and the Compelling Confederation, and some portions of it was controlled by the Compelling Confederation, and they lost control of them or let them go as they needed to consolidate themselves to concentrate on their bigger foes on either side of them. The Turian Concordat in later centuries, late 50s, give it take, there's this brief detente between the Concordat and the Magistry, and they start to jointly settle and exploit worlds in between them and create this colonial region that tries to succeed. There's a pretty lurid story on that sort of scenario that takes place. And so anyway, the says the systems of the reach are not significantly populated before the reunification war. As part of the occupation of periphery following the conflict, many of these marginally settled worlds were transferred into garrisons for the Star League Defense Force to keep order, particularly among the rest of Turian systems. Throughout the Star League era, mandated detente between ourselves, the Turians, the Compellans, and the Star League maintained the peace. Peace, by whatever means it was enforced, allowed each of these powers to further develop the marginal worlds of the Reach. During this period, the Concordat built a great palace fortress on Coromidor. The Compellants constructed vast industrial complexes on Mekdur, and the SLDF built various fortifications across the region. The end of this prosperity and growth was inevitable, however, as the Concordat had used the standoff as cover for their own mech construction operations. By the time of the opening salvos of the new Vandenberg uprising, the worlds of the Reach were home to more than a dozen full mech divisions, which represented only a fraction of the total periphery forces mustered to overthrow the League rule. Catastrophic events that followed plunged the entire Star League into chaos and led to the end of the Cimarron ruling line and shattered any pretense of unity among the great houses and periphery powers. As the First Succession War broke out in the wake of the Kerensky exodus, all major powers in the inner sphere turned their eyes and their military forces towards Terra. Significantly for our own stability and growth, the periphery was largely ignored by the successor states and left to govern themselves. The abandonment of the Reach was slow but inexorably, inevitable. The battle mech warriors, and all the support staff they required were at a premium that cannot be spared to garrison minor, half-colonized worlds at the far edge of the inhabited space. Free from garrisons to enforce that distant will of the compelling Confederation and the Turian Concordat, the planets of the region soon turned to self-rule. Planets incapable of supporting themselves through agriculture trade were quickly depopulated. There are people fleeing to more viable nearby systems. By the end of the 29th century, the Capellans had withdrawn from the Reach, establishing a new border at Ward. Power vacuum led to the opportunistic protector Simeon Calderon attempting an impulsive conquest, seeking to bring the Reach worlds under Turian control. This war was known as the Turian Canopian War, or less charitably, the Shoving Match War. It was an inconclusive exercise. Along with numerous minor raids on outlying systems, the Turians attempted and failed to invade Herodes and Detroit, and by our own counterstrike faltered in the invasions of Portland and formerly known as Portan and Spencer. The conflict was quietly ended by treaty when the Turians retreating in embarrassment, leaving the Reach truly on its own. The Augurian Trade Partnership. The wealthiest and most heavily populated worlds were formerly Turian and Capellan holdings near those states' respective borders, and they went largely untouched by the withdrawal of external rule. Self-sufficient, possessing modern infrastructure, the worlds of Commodore, Utrum, Turlon, and Goldra was able to maintain their independence and a reasonably high standard of living even after the colonial government split or collapsed. Powerful and wealthy merchant families stepped up to fill the power vacuum, foremost among them the Arano family and Espinosa family, both from Commodore. When the Turians withdrew their financial and military support for the governor of Commodore, the head of the Arano family removed Arano, I'm sorry, I'm butchering these names, stepped into the role backed by the Espinosas. Arano declared that he was already what was already obvious in practice. Commodore was now the independent system under the rule of the governor Arano. Without a central authority, however, the expanse of the space between the magistracy and the concordat completely fell into lawlessness and banditry. Rootless mercenaries scavenging the edge of civilization made space travel a risky prospect and made interstellar trade almost impossible. The Arano and Esposa family saw their slow decline mirrored in their own fortunes, and they offered a proposal for their fellow merchant lords, the Augurian Trade Partnership. In early 2870, these two families sent emissaries to leaders in nearby wealthy systems. House Madeira, House Dishamus of Guldura, House Carosus of Smithon, House Gallus of Itram, and House Parata of Tyron. The partnership was conceived as a mutual protection and trade agreement, a way for the Augurian Reach systems to defend against piracy now epidemic in the region. All families agreed to the partnership and together formed a trade council to oversee partnership relations. As the primary financiers of the partnership, the Arano representative was given executive authority. We talk about the coalition, Turian tensions. So this little nascent realm begins to bloom and blossom and brings in some stability and protection for themselves, and in doing so, it attracts additional systems that wish to join, and that's what they're talking about in here. The party should declare itself independent state, encompassing all the founding systems, with herself as first High Lady of the new Augurian Coalition. Strong support of the Espinosa family. Cornea's proposal was accepted by the council. A new state was declared in 2910. And while we were and still the only interstellar government to recognize the new state, Neither the Capellans nor the Turians were interested in reconquest of these former colonies. The Confederation remains focused on waging an endless succession war, and the Concordat was more than concerned with the possibility of incursions by the Federated Sons into their territory. Sheltered by the indifference of these two great powers and emboldened by diplomatic channels to our government, the coalition had room to stabilize and then grow. Excuse me. The industrial system of Mekdur was the first to join the new coalition. Its wealth and technology, both legacies of Capellan occupation and development, were critical to the continued growth of the coalition government. Trade concessions offered by the coalition, along with access to their burgeoning markets, was enough to bring the oligarchs of Mekdur to the negotiating table. With the addition of Mekdur, the coalition began a period of sustained expansion, bringing further along in more marginal systems of Umgard, Mesazangan, Gangtok, Heliat under coalition rule. In most cases, these systems were eager to join the new coalition, as on their own ability to trade and travel in the region was severely restricted by the absence of central control and lack of military enforcement of interstellar law. Umgard, for example, had already lost almost all of the colonial infrastructure that allowed it to survive, was on a steady path of decline toward complete depopulation. The coalition was a lifeline to these marginal systems, allowing them to secure their fragile stability and ultimately, if slowly, regain their prosperity. Turian tensions. As the coalition brought more struggling neighbors under its rule, it was inevitable that the burgeoning nation would come into conflict with the Turian Concordat. The Turians had not formally ceded control of any of these systems, along with their anti-Spinward border, and though in reality they had withdrawn their garrisons and recalled their colonial governors, when they believed the Augurian alliance was a simple trade partnership, the Concordat's government was unconcerned. Minor independent systems arranged trade agreements among themselves all the time. But as the coalition began to look more and more like an expansional state on their border, the Concord became increasingly concerned about security in that region, particularly given the ongoing strife with the Federated Sons. Tensions peaked when the coalition, under rule of the High Lord Kamea Arano II, opened annexation and negotiations with Ea, Regis Rus, Alzai, and Katinka. Although abandoned by colonial rule for more than a century, this cluster of citizens sat much closer to Turian space than any of the coalition had eyed before. Particularly the Turian-like world of Olza was still, according to the Concordat, a viable colony despite functioning under self-rule without external government for more than 50 years. The Turian diplomats soon met with the coalition leadership on Coromor to negotiate a set of treaties. Lord Arano saw talks as an opportunity and recognition from the Concordat and secure the coalition status as a legitimate periphery state. Unfortunately, newly ascended proctor of the Turian Concordat, Thomas Calderon, was more aggressive and militaristic than his mother, and a combination that might have been reached under her rule was all but impossible under that of her son. Negotiations were quickly derailed by bureaucracy, arrogance, and pride. The inability of Lord Arano and the council to broker a compromise was seen by some, including his chief advisor and brother-in-law, Santiago Espinosa, as a significant and unforgivable weakness. Lord Espinosa proposed a dissolution of the council, bringing all the coalition systems under direct rule of the High Lord and allowing Lord Tamati to negotiate directly with the Turians. The Augurian dictatorship, for Christ's sake. Before he made a decision, Espinosa's proposal in 3022, Tamati and his wife Serena were killed in a jump ship accident, ultimately traced to slipshod maintenance of their vessel's Kearney Ferchita Drive. Their lives claimed by the slow collapse of the technological base in the periphery. Antigo made his case to Tamati's heir, Lady Kamea Arano, but Kamea rejected it out of hand. If dictatorial power was the only way to accomplish the goals of the coalition, she argued these goals would need to change. Lord Espinosa found the High Lady to be far less intractable than her father, who had over time become entirely dependent on Espinosa's advice and guidance. Convinced the coalition would crumble in the face of the first real opposition from their neighbors, Santiago Espinosa launched an audacious plan to unilaterally consolidate power. Deposing Kamea in a bloody coup on Corridor, Espinosa reformed the coalition government into an autocracy with himself the head of the Augurian dictatorate. The founding houses were then brought on board through bribery and, where necessary, threats and hostages. Presumed killed in the coup, Kamea fled the capital world with financial support provided by our government through Lady Anna Maria Centrella. Kamea built a resistance movement around a skilled mercenary company that had worked with her family in the past. Using the mercenaries as a tip of her spear, Kamea's Arano Restoration reconquered the dictatorial systems one after another, bringing their ruling families into her camp by diplomacy or force. In several battles, she and her mercenary shock troops fielded SLDF-era assault-class battle mechs, the provenance of which remains unknown. During the conflict, Espinosa revealed a secret alliance he'd arranged with Turian Concordat, through which he fielded heavy and assault mechs piloted by skilled veterans. In the face of this significant military force, the Arano Restoration seemed doomed to the failure. However, in a surprise turn of events, the Turians withdrew their support entirely, leaving Espinosa in an untenable strategic position. Which brings us to the Arano Restoration. After the catastrophic battle which saw a rogue Turian dropship, a fortress-class Iberia, brought down over the surface of Coromor, the Restoration was victorious and Espinosa was executed for treason. However, the fundamental problems that gave Espinosa the opportunity to seize power had not been resolved. The Spenward systems were still claimed by both the Turians and Augurians. The border tensions between the two nations were undiminished. The loyalties of Kamea's noble families were questionable at best, and some still openly spoke of treason and revolt. The coalition's trade, industry, and agriculture was shattered by the war, making famine and chaos almost an inevitability. Our government has largely withdrawn the aid and financial support from Kamea, having accomplished their immediate goal of ensuring the Turians do not acquire a puppet state unopposed. However, as your own assignment demonstrates, diplomatic channels are still open. It's still not clear if the Arano Restoration will survive the war's aftermath. The Augurian systems will teeter on verge of collapse. The Capellans, Turians, Federated Sons would happily see the coalition fail and snatch up its worlds for themselves, which is where the video game's story begins, to be my understanding. So players, as members of the mercenary unit, would conduct various missions to help bolster and to retrieve missing war mechs, battle mechs for the house. So we have our map, and if you look at the region and you look at older regions and newer region maps, this whole neck of the woods is probably one of the most contested near periphery locations in the inner sphere. Out of all the inner sphere, you have the most different. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 key, and we won't count them, but 5 key major players, and they're all within proximity of each other, and so all these settled systems and potentially settled systems within this area becomes a viable ground for everything from skullduggery to treachery to deal making to coup to whatever, to etc. etc. And so to see something like the coalition form and begin to develop, it's not unrealistic. And one of the beautiful things about the BattleTech universe is that there's enough ambiguity in the grand scheme and the story. The inner sphere and the periphery specifically is a vast place, and it's not fully explored or explained. Even inside the major houses, there are still lots of regions of these great houses that are lightly explored, even somewhat unexplored, or untapped and unstoried, which means from a player's perspective, you have plenty of playground. It's a massive sandbox to work from, and so you can set up your own little houses and minor houses. Another thing that comes out of this is it gives us a little bit of an idea of how peerage develops, right? Okay, so the Arano family is a self-declared minor house, their house. And they approached these other, quote, leaders of these neighboring planets to bring together first a trade coalition and then an actual government, or a governmental body. And each one of those groups, are considered minor families. Well, who decided that? Nobody decides that. They did. They chose to say we're House Samara, and it's a House Samara, Samara Shadeus of House Shadeus, and because my family has enough resources and money and power on our little backwater world to set ourselves up as the neo-feudal lord of or lady of that particular planet, we decide we're going to be considered a house. Now this happens over and over and over again throughout the centuries of the the Age of War and the lead up to the SLD, the Star League, and then throughout the Star League era, and then it's established in those earlier sections, and then continues forward in the centuries after. So this is how the House period starts. And then to become legitimized, you need to be recognized by somebody else. So by House Amara being recognized by the magistracy of Canopus as a rulership house of the reach, they gained some legitimacy in the eyes of at least one other larger political body and collection of houses or leaders or nobility. So they recognized the South claimed nobility status of this one little minor house. And because this minor house is set up a coalition with other minor houses within what becomes the coalition, those minor houses are recognized by House Arano, who's, quote, the leading house becomes the ruling house of the coalition because they have peerage, acceptance and acknowledgement of at least one political body. Ideally, what the Espinozas was pushing for was to get that recognition from the Turian Concordat. At this point, it truly becomes a periphery nation because now you have at least two powers that recognize your authority and your family bloodline and those other minor bloodlines of these minor houses that are affiliated with your own. So this would have been a really crucial step for longevity for the coalition. The fact is the coalition existed for a better part of 100 years is testament a lot of work and hard effort and stuff on the part of all the little ruling families that work together under the leadership of the Ranos. Had they gained the Turian Concordat recognition, it would have snowballed. Ideally, in my opinion, I think the Capellans, or at least the Federated Sons and the Free Worlds League, probably would have jumped on board, even if it was just tacitly, because it's a checks and balance thing. You know, they want to get their 2 cents in there, get their influence in, etc., etc. Capellans might have been less likely to do that, to recognize them, in the same reason that the Calderons chose not to, is because they didn't want to legitimize yet another periphery power, another power base to threaten their claims to the area. So that's how a lot of this gets established and works. And the same thing is repeated over and over again all across the inner sphere or in the early days. And most of these ones that exist by the time 3025 comes around and we all start gaming and playing and enjoying the world that that the BattleTech people have created. Those are well-established houses and leadership and well-established accepted governments of various planets throughout the inner sphere, whether they like to accept them or not. But it helps establish how the process is begun, how it's continued, and how it becomes legitimately formalized. This allows for additional nation states to develop. We've seen that, like I said, I've already done some videos on the really tiny periphery powers like the Marian hegemony and so on and so forth, the Censarius Federation. These are places that started out as bandit kingdoms or wealthy individuals with an idea and a plot and a plan, and over time and effort and work, they're developing into a periphery power. I'll bet a very minor power, but the fact is that they're accepted. They're now on the general maps. People know that's what they're supposed to be in that region. There's some sort of pseudo-legitimate government out there, and given enough time and effort, they will expand into something bigger. This is where we see the evolution of the coalition. You get a handful of core worlds that got together for trade reasons and then for mutual protection, and realize that together they can accomplish more than they can individually. This strength and growth encourages yet even more planets. So we bring into the industrial world of Mekdor, for example. This brings in what I talk about. In order for a prepary nation to be successful, they need to be able to produce weapons and munitions and parts. They need to have produce agriculture. They need to have a developing technical base, which means they need to have some education systems in place and the ability to grow within their own means. If they're totally dependent on raiding the neighbors to take what they need to sustain a subsistence lifestyle, then they're never going to be successful and they're never going to grow. Well, the coalition is in that process. They were pushed until they had a conflict of interest. When the Arano family seemed unable to get the Turians to come to the table and recognize them, the Espinosas believed they could do it through different means and dispose of Arano, and in the process of doing so, started the reverse process. So when Arano comes back in and regains control, and they start to redevelop things based off of the video game, after the video game concludes, time, it just doesn't get the motion that development era has stymied, and politics has changed, and even the Canopan pull their support, and at this point it's just a decline, and eventually it breaks apart and falls apart and becomes a bunch of independent nations, independent systems once more, until like I said, 3050 or 3070, somewhere in there, when the Concordat and the magistracy get together again to try to form a colonial region. The idea being is they were trying to grow together and get more of a power base out here. And then we add into the mix that it's established that prior to, or the beginning of the Star League and all through the Star League, including the Reunification War, the SLDF itself had a significant presence in this region of space. In part, this probably helped encourage these systems that are not reconnecting with the Canopans and the Concordat and the other great houses to remain somewhat independent. Because it's conducive to politics and defense if you have this so-called no man's land, if you will, in between all these potential locations. This also helps to explain one of the questions that comes up every now and then, because I've watched some other videos on the coalition and the story itself, and I've read some stuff on some opinion pieces from other people that's been posted out there through Sarnanet, that how is it the coalition is able, Rampart Company is able to field some pretty cutting edge equipment, and where does all these heavy assault mechs come from? The idea that the Turian Concordat is going to feed the Espinosa family a bunch of heavy and assault mechs is dodgy. It's not impossible. It's just really unlikely, in part because, like all the periphery nations, and even some of the intersphere nations, heavy and assault mechs, especially assault mechs, are very hard to acquire, and they don't have the means to produce them themselves. Now, the Concordat and the Magistracy both have the ability to produce heavy mechs, but their assault mech production is extremely limited or non-existent. They they have to purchase them outright from someplace else or steal them. They're acquiring them through third parties. So the idea that they're going to take these precious, extremely valuable machines and then, quote, loan them to the coalition or the Espinosa faction of the dictatorate is dubious, in my opinion. Where the same side of the opposite side of that coin is the original Arano family and their forces, Rampart's company having access to basically very cutting-edge equipment in a region of space that should not have them, let alone be able to produce or manufacture, or even to some degree be able to maintain them, is pushing it. It's great for the video game, but it's it doesn't fit with the lore as we know of the periphery. The exception to that is the SLDF. And it's one of the videos I'm going to be doing next. We're going to be talking about some of these beautiful gems that could have been found. The fact is that the SLDF, prior, during the Star League era, and right toward the end, seemed to there seems to be this huge surplus. And this is a running meme throughout BattleTech, that there's just this almost endless seeming series of brine catches and supply depots and storage, hidden storage vaults that that the Star League has created and left behind, and that just keeps getting found. And some of them are small, and some of them are fairly large and robust, and we see that in the stories, and it's a beautiful thing. It's a wonderful MacGuffin to have, but the idea that there's 20 or 30 or 40 of these things scattered about out here in just this neck of the woods, and I'm just using that as an example. Enough of these have been found over the centuries that you would think they'd become even harder, and fewer and fewer and fewer in between. And just pointing out, so the chances that the Rampart Company or the people who helped establish Rampart Company got their hands on some kind of SLDF catch, and it doesn't come up in the story, it's not mentioned in the story, right? So I guess it's just, there's like a lot of things, a lot of stuff that we are geared to just look the other way, or questions we don't choose not to ask about the what, whores, and whys of how that sort of stuff works out. So we get into the social political structure, forms and traditions of the Augurian government trained largely intact during the dictatorial period. Lady Arano's restoration attempts to undo the recent political upheaval, a routine of forms and traditions in the coalition. The coalition governs an elected monarchy with a High Lady or High Lord chosen by a founding council of representatives from the founding houses, as well as the planetary representatives from the major systems in the coalition. Practice, the monarch is chosen well in advance of the election, etc., etc. The founding houses, there are 7 founding houses, but only 5 of them are currently seated. So once again, for this political body, this would-be political body to develop and grow, these 7 founding groups or families who called themselves houses, called themselves nobles of some sort, set up and got together and formed the foundation, the basis for this nascent house. And in doing so, they recognize each other as peerage, and it's through an element of legitimacy gets gained when the Canopans additionally recognize House Arano first, and then the other 6 founding families as peers or nobles, which formally allows them to really justify having the claim of being a house. So we got the various houses, and I'm not going to go into detail on each one of them. Then we have religion, culture, and the arts, which every world in human space has got some sort of religion, some sort of culture, and some sort of art, even if it's just crude. And the development and intermixing of those is what makes the society what it is, social economics. Once again, you can't really have any kind of stellar power, or even a planetary power, if you don't have a solid, or at least a marginal economic base of some kind. We go back to the bandit states. They're verging on legitimacy. Well, they started out with nothing, and they took it from their neighbors, but they invested some of that in developing their own worlds and acquiring other worlds that can assist in that development to help to grow their own economy, to have a viable economy that doesn't 100% depend on sticking their hands in somebody else's pockets to keep it afloat, or depending on a third party like Comstar or Word of Lake or another great house to keep them funded. If they have to do that, then they're not a viable economy. They're not going to survive in the long run. So we've got a couple of corporations couple important aspects. One of the crucial Achilles heels that the coalition, the Augurian Coalition appears to have, is it absolutely has nearly no jump ships of their own. There's very few of them. They're not mentioned. The only real mention of them is a handful of the families, and then of course this corporation that's Gwendor Dorian Cartel, Cheap Products Jump Ship Logistics. Originally a Canopian merchant corporation specialized shipment of exquisite wines and other luxury goods across known space, blah, blah, blah. So apparently they have a handful of jump ships, and they have some drop ships, and they form the core backbone of the transportation network for the Reach. And then there'll be a handful of independents that come and go, maybe one or two of these minor houses actually, they all would have some sort of drop ship in their possession, because that's power, adds to wealth. Jump ships are going to be even extremely harder and rare. What's interesting that I take out of this, and this goes into something I've been hee-hawing, beating around the bush on a number of videos over the last couple of years, or year and a half since I started doing BattleTech stuff, is how does the periphery maintain and service the jump ships they have? It's to the best of our knowledge, there are no there are no jump ship manufacturing yards anywhere in the periphery that we are aware of. And from game canon perspective, they're very rare, and the few of them that do exist are well defended, well protected core systems that the great houses are very adamant about looking after. That doesn't mean that there isn't the ability of having a minor shipyard, a repair bay for jump ships in various places. And so to me, for the Turian Concordat, for example, having one of the largest periphery navies in existence, as far back as their earliest conception, it makes sense to me that they have several of these orbital shipyards set up someplace so they can maintain and repair, and perhaps even assemble the occasional jump ship from scavenged parts. So in order for you to have a viable navy, and at one time the Turians had one of the most powerful warship fleets in the periphery. It was on par with any of the great houses during that was what made one of the battles of the Reunification War so bloody within with the Turian Concordat, was the fact that they could field well in excess of 100 plus warships. Well, that, to me, that tells me at some point in the Concordat's history, they actually had to have a shipyard or two. They just had to. The idea that they bought all these warships from the other great houses, I find that questionable. I'm sure they did acquire a percentage of them, but the idea that why would they not make every effort to, if they're going to be that progressive on warships? And then if we talk about the defunct Rimworld of the House Arano fame, we know damn well that they had shipyards because they were building their own warships that were bigger and badder and stronger than anything the SLDF could field. That's in canon. So that means, hello, that somewhere in the periphery, these shipyards did exist at one time. Now, they were probably early collateral damage from the Reunification War and then the later First Succession War, because these are highly valuable targets that you want to either control, and if you can't control, you kind of don't want your neighbors to control them. So that's what made the First Succession War such a damaging thing to technology, is because they went full-heartedly at everything they could to predict, if we can't have it, you shouldn't have it, kind of thing. There's another story that circulates later, many years later, about Cranston Snords the Regulars. Rhonda Snords succeeds her father, and I have never read the book where this occurred, but I know it happens. They actually find a secret shipyard intact a Starfleet era shipyard in the Dark Nebula, and nobody else seems to know where it is. But this actually allows the regulars to produce warships on a very small scale. The very fact that they have the ability to produce jump ships of any type, let alone a warship, is staggering. But it also reinforces my belief that they do exist. Those would be the ultimate MacGuffins. If you're doing your own storyline game, if you're going to have something that's a little outside the regular sandbox for the BattleTech, that would be one of those beautiful MacGuffins. So the Coalition, like I said, has a very very limited jump ship pool. This really hamstrings their ability to do anything when it's compared to their neighbors. The other Canopus and the Turns, they just got all the mobility. And considering how limited their mobility is compared to, say, the Compellans and Federated Suns, well, that makes these guys almost non-existent. So it's important to have one or two of these little companies and some independents. If they had a bit more of a stronger mercantile navy, jump ship capacity base that was in their own personal control. So just like when it says that the Arano family are the lord and lady are killed when their jump ship fails. Catastrophic failure of the jump drive. So that's probably, while a rare event, happens more frequently in BattleTech than people acknowledge. You've got a jump ship that's hundreds of years old, potentially even older than that, 500, 600 years old, and it's been held together by prayer and duct tape and baling twine and dumb luck for the last century and a half or 2 centuries, because there simply isn't very many places to go and get these things fixed and maintained, or there just isn't the knowledge and or the ability to get the necessary parts to make them stay. This is why the fleets of the inner sphere are much better shape, even though they're as small and diminished as they are by canon. And I was reading some stuff yesterday that there's a later book that I think it's one of the first mercenary source books, which I have, and I'm going to have to go in and dig around and suggest that the canon they did attempt to uptick the sheer number of jump ships. The original proposal was around 2,000 for the inner sphere period. That wasn't counting the periphery. So if you figure 2,000 for the inner sphere, potentially another 400 or 500 for the greater and greater periphery, spread out around between all the various factions that would have them. This later in the mercenary book somewhere implies there's 3,300 or something like that, 3,300 jump ships. Now we're getting in a little bit more acceptable numbers. Is still way low in my eyes, but an additional 1,000 odd ships does make a difference in making things the economic flow in a viable manner in my mind anyway. So it says here, the cartel revitalized trade in the Augurian Reach region by refurbishing a maintenance slip for jump ships at Mekdur, thereby establishing the basic infrastructure for regular jump ship traffic. So everything I was just talking about, this phrase helps anchor that assumption that there were, and in the time, more shipyards and shipyard capacity in the periphery than what has ever been acknowledged. And the fact that there was a derelict yard or a repair slip in orbit around this periphery world, and it's in a position where these people were able to refurbish it enough to bring it into functionability so they can use it to maintain and do more than minor work, because you can do some maintenance and some repairs in the field, literally in orbit at a jump point. If you have across the inner sphere, we have a lot of surviving space stations and stuff that have the logistics, the dudes and the techs in the suits, and the little moving, the little mini tugs and crap that help move shit around. So you can do a lot of stuff in space, but some things really need to have a infrastructure, a functioning structure of sorts to consolidate that in. And that's what one of these, if you've ever seen Star Trek, all you got to do is think of the shipyards. that you see occasionally, and that's what I'm looking at. I'm not looking at it as a vast space station where these ships can go in and be serviced or built from whatever process, but you see them like anything else. It's also interesting to know that they point out in canon, in story, that it could take upwards of 2 years to build a battleship, to build a warship. So it potentially takes a year to build just a straight jump ship, which doesn't have all the extra bells and whistles that a warship does. And to suggest that the uh, House Amorous had a fleet that was on par with the SLDS and had warships that were even bigger and badder than the biggest battleship that the SLDS could field at that time implies that they had more than one shipyard and they'd been at this for a long time. And I've got some questions and some what ifs and other stuff about that whole scenario that I've been working a little bit on, making some notes and stuff on that, because uh, on a little bit of a sidebar, how is it that Rimworld Republic and House Amorous were able to build up such a massive fleet and such a impressive, well-trained military that they did? I mean, they moved some 40 to 50 battle mech regiments alone from the Republic during the height of the reunification war. They moved them to the hegemony to help, protect the hegemony under a skullduggery and cloak and dagger crap, was they were, as Amherst was in the process of the long game that he was playing. This means they spent decades or centuries building this massive military force up and training them and getting all the infrastructure that was required to do that. It's just, you don't just buy 5,000 battle mechs in an afternoon. You have to build them up. You have to train those pilots. You have to, and those units to become veteran and in some cases elite. They need a lot of time and effort and training and actual, combat. So when was this all happening? Where was this all happening? Somewhere off stage, somewhere deeper in the periphery, someplace, somewhere. So I'm just saying, right? And how is it that the Star League's intelligence corps never caught on to it? Nobody really paid attention. I know they were really, really busy. I understand that it was a pretty rough and bloody time for the SLDF and the Star League in general. It was real stressful period, those last 15 or so years before Amorous whacked the Camerons and set himself up as dictator for life of the Inner Sphere. But hello? Just saying, that whole topic's worthy of a video on its own. Anyway, so we get into the military forces. Historically, the Augurian Coalition military, or ACM, was feudal in nature, each founding house maintaining its own force and military action required the consent of the council before any troops could be called up or deployed. During the dictatorate years, one of the first policies instituted by the Espinosa brought all the house military forces under his control. Each house battalion was mobilized and deployed somewhere other than its home system, etc., etc. So, you talk about... during the Restoration War, High Lady Arano piloted a Kintaro. In 3025, this was roughly 3025, 3030 that this was going on. And she's higher. Kintaros were extremely rare by that time, because it says so in canon. There's only two sources of where that they either found one in some catch somewhere, which explains all the heavy assault mechs that the Rampart Company and the so-called Royal Guards were able to field, or Comstar provided it, because Comstar had a huge, massive supply of this Star League era stuff, and we don't see any of that until the years leading up to or during the clan invasion and the gradual introduction to the Inner Sphere, to the Comm Guards, and especially the Battle of Tukiad, when we really get the Inner Sphere really gets a feel for just how massive Comstar's military arm really was. Anyway, so military forces. Oh yeah, and another thing, the book mentions the Amaro's Royal Guard unit several times, but there's no function for it. I mean, there's no breakdown of the military units, and let alone the guard. There's no unit profiles for these things. Other than Rampart, there's very little in here. Where you find in most of the other source books for house source books, periphery states, and things like that, they all have that. Somehow, when the writers created this, they either purposely chose to leave it out or they forgot about it, which is kind of sad because it's kind of belongs in here. I mean, you get a taste of it, but there's no real flavor to it. I mean, Rampart Company is the primary force that the video game is surrounded by. But and we talk about the Royal Guard, and it's veteran and it's fanatical, but it doesn't tell us how big it is. It doesn't tell its makeup. What, how many companies did it have? What was its what was the average mech unit size? Were they medium light mechs? To suggest that the Aranos fielded a battalion or regiment of heavy and assault mechs as their Royal Guard is pushing it. They don't have much in the way of a jump ship fleet, and they're a nascent nation it's much further along than where the Marian hegemony is now and the Caesarius Federation is now, and that's what they're going to be in another 100 years if things progress and continue to go in their favor. So we get into our personalities of the various people and pilots. These are the leaders of the houses, their factions and stuff like that that you're dealing with. Then we get our look into some of the key planets of the Reach itself. And we come to another one of those things where I go, okay, right? So we've established at great length that this whole region has been highly contested for generations, for centuries. Various different houses, minor and major, have had impact and influences within the Reach, ignoring the coalition itself. Most of these planets are marginal planets. They're either on their way down or just eking out of existence. So, to have any significant population planets and not have them been eyed much more frequently than they were is, once again, a little bit questionable. They're talking about 1 million to 2 million population for Cormater 5 and Cormater 6. So we're looking at total is a little over 909 million and almost 2 billion. So we're looking at almost 3 billion people living in this system. 3 billion with a B. There are large, important planets in the great houses that don't have populations approaching that. Capital of the Turian Concordat isn't approaching this size. So how this planet didn't become a much more dominant player earlier on or all through the ages, the various ages of Battletech, is beyond me. And it considered it's a backwater. They call it because of its location. No, I have problems eating into that. See, and we get another one here with over 100 million. See, and we get into these. We're 15 million, maybe 57. That's 57 million. That's impressive. 1.4 billion people for Vector. And you're going to tell me the compellents just let that go? An industrial planet with 1.4 billion people on it, and it's got all kinds of industrial capacity, and they just waltzed away from it and never bothered to hang on to it. Meanwhile, it says here yet another 150,000 people live in various orbital colonies, research and manufacturing settlements on the system's other uninhabitable worlds, and in recharging stations and associated space colonies. Hello? So, okay. Once again, fantasy. Sci-fi fantasy, it's still fantasy, and it can be anything you want it to be. And if you want to say that, okay, 3.2 is much more I can buy into that. But now we're down here to 91 million. No, I'm having issues with that. So, yes, there's a damn good reason why these 7 houses or 7 systems came together to form the coalition. They had the numbers and the resources, and they had a viable economy. They had a solid industry, an industrial base. they still lacked in some crucial areas, and there's still some stuff that's a little bit less than covered than what I would have been happy with. But anyway, so we got an intelligence report on Rampart Company itself, which is traditional. Most of your mech units and stuff. Where I run into my grunt issues is, once again, 3026 is roughly when this all occurs. 3026. And this periphery, wannabe periphery nation is running around with assault mechs and heavy mechs like anybody. Most other people are, periphery units are grateful to have mediums. I just go, sure. Okay. I mean, yeah, there's a number of lights, but they're just, I have issues with it. Great for the video game. And then, of course, that actually sets the tone. And I watched that over the last 20 years. The more elaborate and more fancier the video games that have come out over the decades, the more developed they are, the funner they are. They bring in an entire different generation or entire different class of player, type of player, who's the video game people as opposed to the tabletops and role-playing people. Even though some of those are all the same, but there's now 3 distinct groupings for the franchise, for the fan base. Like I said, you get used to certain things. The video games are taking care of a lot of stuff for you that you didn't have to worry about, or you just assume it isn't an issue. And things like salvage and repair and maintenance and keeping your things supplied and munitions replaced and so on and so forth. So we'll just drive our mechs, and everybody wants a heavy mech or an assault mech because of the sheer firepower. It's the it's not the go-to. That's like I've always said when I was had a lot of players and people coming in and out back in the day. I said I always insisted on a new player playing in a medium mech. I wanted them to learn the nuances of a mech in the 40 to 50 run range, because it gave them a taste and a reality as how the game should be played in my mind. Light mechs are way undergunned and lightly armored for good reason, and they serve very specific purposes and roles, and putting a newbie in one of those is kind of is setting them up for some very big disappointments. On the other hand, giving them a powerhouse brawler or bruiser is also setting them up, because now they're going to have unrealistic feel for what they think they ought to be able to have. And if that's all your game is, about a min-max mindset, good for you, right? I just don't think that's conducive to a healthy game system based on the flavor, the spirit of what the game is. And that's a key thing. A lot of people are aware of the flavor and the spirit, and then there's a lot of people who don't understand even what that concept is exactly. What does that mean? I mean, now I can do a video on that. I think I may have done one in the past for some other reason. Anyway, so then we get some scenarios that was set up based off of the video game's various things you needed to achieve. Then we get an annex for some additional rule sets, which is fine. And you'll note, and I will note this, they understood the concept back then. This was definitely from that era. Pre-existing damage, right? You're not guaranteed a brand new machine. In reality, most machines have seen a lot of mileage. Some of them have developed quirks. Some of them might have damaged or missing items. So we have pre-existing damage table, which I like, right? I'm just saying. The Argo class dropship, okay. There's enough ambiguity left. There's enough range of non-game canon set dropships and jump ships to allow for the specials. And as long as they fall within the category, the general consumption or consensus on how a jump ship should function, or a warship should function, or a dropship should function, I'm good with it. So this thing is kind of like a hybrid. fine. It could have been a one-off, never before seen before again. And even in the book itself, at the end of the adventure, it goes off on some long-range mission and isn't part of the House Arano's restoration phase, from my understanding. So anyway, there you have House Arano. And hey, if you can get your hands on this, this is well worth a read. And there's, like I said, there's a lot of things to take away from it. Other than the fact that it's a great environment to have a campaign in and to play, and I imagine the video game was a blast to play too. But it gives us the insights of how these many smaller nation states and houses within the great houses of the inner sphere came to be and how they were formed, and their development would have been some along, maybe not exactly parallel to how the coalition is formed and it plays out, but it's a great example. It also gives us some tool sets for creating our own special houses and non-canon environments for the grander sandbox that is BattleTech. And once again, I also believe that this story happens all the time in various edges and areas of the inner sphere. There's so much area and place in the inner sphere that you can have plenty of room to add new stuff that's of your own creation, which is also a big part and fun of the game. Till next time, this is Rick, and I hope you guys have a great weekend. It's turning out to be a nice sunny day here. Geez, we had snow yesterday. I'm tired of snow and cold. I want to start complaining about the damn humidity and heat. Anyway, till next time, this is Rick. You guys have a great weekend.